Hello everyone, today I want to talk to you about something that I actually really care about this time. I wanted to talk about the X-Men entering the cinematic universe of Marvel, more often referred to as the CUM, obviously, with the fact that Miss Marvel straight up name-dropped mutants.
Kamala, there's something different in your genes, like a mutation.
As well as She-Hulk having a sort of Easter egg referencing a guy with metal claws getting into a bar fight, the introduction of the X-Men gets closer and closer every day, and I'm trying to beat that. So yes, the title is clickbait to an extent. I think a more accurate title would be The X-Men Should Learn from the Eternals and Move On with Its Lessons. However, that's not as catchy and doesn't roll off the tongue, and I guarantee you wouldn't have clicked on it otherwise. So I win. So first, I feel like I should probably explain what do I mean the best part of the Marvel Universe should be similar in any way to this absolute dumpster fire of a film. So I'm not going to do like a frame-by-frame dissection video essay of the Eternals. Plenty of other people have done that. You could go watch one of those. Instead, I want to pick out some of the things that the Eternals did well, in my opinion, because it's a movie and it does things well despite the overall thing not being good. I want to pick out the good parts because there were good parts, and these are parts that I think need to go into the X-Men moving forward. Okay, I'm about to ad-lib this, and this is all coming from my memory. Okay, so there's these things called the Celestials, and they sort of act like gods to the Marvel Universe, or one corner of the gods. Anyway, the Celestials lay eggs, but the eggs they lay are inside the planets, like in the core of the planet, right? And once the planet reaches a high enough population density, then the egg hatches and it absorbs all the life force and it breaks the planet apart and it kills everything. To protect the beings, the species that are needed to hatch the space egg, the Celestials created these weird wolf things led by Alexander Skarsgård. The thing is, the wolves started eating the species that the Celestials were raising. So they created the Eternals, and the Eternals protect the planets and kill Alexander Skarsgård. Okay, Jesus Christ. I look like an insane man. The whole drama with the Eternals, right, comes in the fact that they are raising an entire planet of different species and races to essentially die once the egg gets enough life juice. This movie is so fucking dumb. Jesus. They're having to grapple with the fact that they are raising a entire planet to die, and they can't interfere in any way. They can only accelerate. Which, in all honesty, is a little counterintuitive because there was like this whole mustache guy that they probably should have stopped because he set back the life juice meter by like, what, 12 million or something? The whole thing is really just existential and nihilistic the entire way. And that is something that the Eternals actually did really well. On top of that, there's a scene that I remember not really being that comfortable with, and it's not because I'm like super immature or anything. It's the scene where Icarus and Cersei did it. The reason that it made me uncomfortable is because it felt kind of forced, right? It seemed like Icarus has been telling her that they are the only two immortal beings that can really elope, because Cersei, despite loving a human, is going to outlive him. The entire reason that she exists is to make sure that he dies for their space god. It just felt very forced and predatory in this like weird way that I can't fully explain, and maybe that's just me looking at it a different way, but that's the way that I perceived. Another thing the Eternals did absolutely fantastic fantastically was it was very character driven rather than this overall arcing MCU story focus. And in all honesty, I don't think that's bad. Director Chloe Zhao is known for having slower burn character drama pieces. And while that is something that could be introduced into the MCU and could be really good, I think the problem was not the fact that it was done, but who it was done with. So to get back to the original point, I'm not saying that every X-Men MCU film needs to be this slow burn character drama, but I think that the first film absolutely should. This obviously is coupled with the fact that Disney has confirmed that they are working on an X-Men cartoon, sort of a reboot of the X-Men 97 cartoon, which is really good, by the way. So here's my little elevator pitch, right? Have the cartoon sort of set up the existence of the characters as well as explain their powers as well as you can, whereas the MCU movie is really just focused on the character relationships and how they interact with one another. Why is Wolverine at Charles Xavier's school? That's a question that you can answer in both of those. Something that this film would need to do is stand on its own rather than rely on the TV show, which is something that we have seen happen in the MCU in a very bad way. In Doctor Strange 2, the entire premise and the stakes are set up in WandaVision. So if you haven't seen WandaVision, you don't really understand who these kids are and why Wanda has such an affinity for them. And it's not because people didn't understand based on WandaVision, it's because some people probably just hadn't seen WandaVision. Something that went wrong with the Eternals that probably wouldn't go wrong with the X-Men is that the Eternals are really just kind of dumb. They're sort of this like DC Super Friends riff in the Marvel universe, and it's kind of obvious. The X-Men are their own characters and they can stand on their own. It's not even a matter of a lesser known comic group that couldn't even sell comic books on their own being translated to the silver screen in a bad way. It's a bad group of characters being translated to the silver screen in a bad way. The characters just weren't that strong to begin with, and I don't know why the MCU insisted that they would be incredibly important going forward. The X-Men, on the other hand, have their own personalities as well as a lot more of their own original power sets. Powers that can be explained relatively quickly, even through just visual cues, if nothing else. Wolverine has metal claws and a metal skeleton, and he can heal really quick, and he doesn't really age. Long story short is the MCU X-Men film doesn't need to focus on the powers as much as it did with the Eternals. And with the Eternals, it didn't really need to focus on the powers at all. It just kind of needed to say, hey, you know DC movies? That. I want to talk about some of the characteristics that I think should go into this MCU X-Men movie. So I hit on Wolverine, and I think that he should definitely be the older, more grizzled Logan that we see in the film Logan. But more importantly, I think that he should be taking on a paternal role specifically to X-23. What's her name? Laura Kinney, that's it. I think that Laura Kinney should be enrolled in Charles Xavier's school for gifted. Logan should be looking after her as she sort of is his daughter, but, you know, clone, sort of. Something else that I've seen sort of amplified by the fan cast is Giancarlo Esposito playing Professor Xavier. Now, I think this is a fantastic idea for a totally different reason. I don't think that Giancarlo should totally switch and suddenly be playing this like wise mentor character, because Professor Xavier has the ability to be a straight up villain. This is coming from some of the comic runs, right? And I'm not saying that the version of Professor X that we get in the film should be a villain. I'm saying that he should be villain-ish. So now is a million-dollar question, and one that I think Marvel is having a relatively tough time answering as they're adding more characters onto the roster. Because initially in the comics, the Infinity War was sort of this big culminative. But the problem with the MCU is that not everyone was there during the Infinity War because Disney didn't have the rights to everyone like the Fantastic Four and the X-Men at the time. But now they do, and as they're going forward, they're trying to bring more and more of these characters in, and it's just sort of like not really landing that well. And it sort of seems like they're just trying to say, oh, well, this character didn't exist until after the Infinity War. Which, like, works, but, like, at the same time, it just feels kind of lazy. Like, after a certain amount of characters you do that with, it just starts to feel like your easy exit. And unlike the Eternals that were explained in a very lazy way by saying, oh, we just can't interfere, or potentially, the movie's not out yet, the Fantastic Four, the X-Men have a fully legitimate reason for not showing up during the Infinity War, and it all goes back to Captain America's Civil War. Something that is sort of glazed over, especially when you look back, is that technically Iron Man won the Civil War. And more importantly, the Sokovia Accords were ratified, which labeled Steve Rogers, Captain America, as war criminals. This ties into the comic run of Civil War, specifically the Amazing Spider-Man Civil War tie-in. And in the Amazing Spider-Man tie-in, it introduced something called the Superhero Registration Act. And this is incredibly important. In the comics, the Superhero Registration Act essentially acted as this sort of government registry, saying that anybody who did vigilanteism, superheroing, had to register with a government body. In the comics, Team Cap was against the Superhero Registration Act, saying that it's not really fair to make everybody who puts on a mask and does superheroism register with the government when there are people that want to actively hunt them down. See, in the comics, the X-Men were already introduced, and being born with a mutant gene isn't something that you can just really control. In the comics, the mutants are sort of looked on as this minority group. Another group known as the Purifiers act as this sort of ultra-nationalist, ghost, costume-wearing group that want to make the mutants not exist. I think I'm using enough terminology that it doesn't get flagged. But in the comics, the Superhero Registration Act would make your mutant, your legal name, your location, your age, your superpowers, and your weaknesses all publicly available on government databases. And this poses a problem because, like I said, the X-Men are openly persecuted by groups that want to make them not exist, specifically the Purifiers. So, like I said just a second ago, technically Iron Man won the Civil War, which means the Superhero Registration Act was enacted and then later repealed. I'll get to that in a second. Meaning that it is entirely hypothetical that Professor Xavier and the mutants were there for this Infinity War, but Xavier kept them on lockdown rather than letting them out and potentially risking everyone. He just said, stay home. Again, this sort of feeds back into the thing that I was saying earlier, where we do sort of see Professor X as more of a villain rather than the noble character that he is usually presented to be. I've had this entire script locked in the chamber for a while, and then I decided on a whim to watch She-Hulk. My honest review, it was okay. But one thing that I thought was absolutely insane was this scene.
I believe Miss Walters will find that Mr. Jacobson's record as it pertains to customer satisfaction to be spotless. Oh, if the defendant has nothing to hide, then why not hear from his
I would
clients?
say that's a gross invasion of people's privacy based on a very shaky what if.
This is a very common procedure in product liability lawsuits. It is material to the case whether this type of malfunction has affected other people. There is no inherent right to privacy when employing Mr. Jacobson's tailoring services.
But we're not just talking about a product here. The very nature of Mr. Jacobson's line of work, making suits exclusively for superheroes, necessitates anonymity. May I remind you that the Sokovia Accords have been repealed.
Superheroes operate in the public eye. As public figures, it is assumed that there will be some loss of privacy.
The distinction here is we're not talking about celebrities. We're talking about superheroes who have enemies who will try to harm them, and the people close to them, the ones who didn't ask to be a part of this life. Now, Ms. Walters chose to have her identity be public, but it isn't up to her to choose for everyone else. This isn't about privacy for privacy's sake. If this information is not protected, not only would it ruin my client's career, it could put a lot of people in a lot of danger.
And let's pretend that it's not just sort of something that was thrown out there to sound like legal jargon, right? If Matt Murdock, vigilante lawyer extraordinaire, or as he so delicately puts it, a really good lawyer, makes an explicit note that the Sokovia Accords were repealed, then that means, yeah, it's entirely possible the Superhero Registration Act that I just spent the entire fucking time explaining could have been enacted and then later repealed as they realized, you know, maybe having a vigilante around isn't such a bad idea. All this really to say is that, yeah, it's entirely possible that Professor Xavier eased up on the restrictions, which led to the Easter egg that we saw in the She-Hulk frickin' thing. Okay, the real reason that I'm making this is because I have a ton of ideas about these massive IPs, as well as my own opinions, and I want to get them out onto somewhere, rather than just sort of have it bounce around my head, making me insane. But yeah, that's about it.